I was hiking through the woods to one of my favorite spots, a place I'd been to several times before. It was well off the main trail and hidden enough that most people probably didn't even know it was there. The spot itself was a small, elevated bluff overlooking the ocean, and whenever I wanted to get away from everything for a while, that was where I'd go. On this particular day, I was alone. I'd packed myself some lunch and made the hike out to the bluff, then sat down with my back toward the woods and looked out over the water. Everything was peaceful. I'd been sitting there for a while, eating and just letting my mind wander. I wasn't thinking about anything in particular. I was completely comfortable, because I'd done this many times before. Then something happened that I still have no explanation for. While I was sitting there, my entire visual perspective suddenly shifted. It was almost like I was no longer seeing through my own eyes. For a moment, I was looking at myself from somewhere about 5 to 10 feet behind me. I could see myself sitting there on the bluff. Then that perspective started moving. It came toward me from behind, almost as if someone was walking directly up to where I was sitting. As it got closer, my perspective shifted again. Suddenly, I was looking at myself from the front, and that's when I saw it. There was something standing directly behind me. It was so close that its face was right beside mine, leaning over my shoulder. Its right hand was covering my mouth, while its left hand was covering my eyes. The fingers were long and unnaturally thin. They were so large and gangly that they seemed to cover most of my face without any effort. I could see its face beside mine. It had a wide mouth that looked almost like it was grinning, but there was nothing friendly about the expression. I remember feeling an immediate sense of malevolence from it. The strange thing is, the first comparison that came into my mind was Groot from the Marvel movies. Not exactly Groot, obviously. It just had something about the shape of its face and body that vaguely reminded me of him, except this thing looked twisted and evil. The entire sequence happened incredibly fast. It felt like I saw all of it in the space of maybe a second, but somehow, I saw enough to understand exactly what I was looking at. Something was behind me. It had its hands over my mouth and eyes, and it looked like it was trying to grab me. I completely freaked out. At the same time, some part of my mind immediately rejected what I was seeing. No, this isn't real. I jumped to my feet and spun around. There was nothing there, just the woods. I stood there for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. I was extremely shaken, but I forced myself to stay calm. I started gathering my things and packing up my lunch and gear. And that's when I noticed something else. The silence. It wasn't just that the woods were quiet, they were completely silent. There were no birds, no insects, nothing moving. And as I stood there packing, I became intensely aware of the woods behind me. I couldn't see anything, but I had this overwhelming feeling that something was watching me. And it wasn't just the normal feeling you get when you're alone in the woods and start imagining things. It felt like hatred. I could almost feel the anger coming from the trees. It was so intense that it seemed tangible. I remember thinking that whatever was out there didn't want me around. I finished packing and started walking back toward the main trail. The entire time, I had this strange certainty that I wasn't going to make it back. I expected something to appear, something to come out of the woods, something to stop me before I reached the trail. I kept walking anyway. I don't remember hearing much of anything during that walk. Then suddenly I heard a bird. It was a crow. I can't really explain why, but hearing it brought me an enormous sense of relief. It was almost as if the sound itself told me that I was back in something normal. I kept walking, and when I finally reached the main trail, I felt even more relieved. Whatever had happened back there, at least I was no longer alone on that secluded part of the woods. I've thought about the experience a lot since then, and the part that still bothers me the most isn't even seeing the creature. It's what I felt I understood in that moment. I had this strange realization that if I'd actually believed the thing was real while I was seeing it, something would have happened to me. I felt like I would have somehow lost myself, like it was trying to get me to accept that it was real, almost like it was baiting me into believing in another reality, and if I accepted it, I wouldn't be able to come back from it. I don't know if that makes any sense, and I don't know what I actually saw, but there is one other detail that has always bothered me. At the time, I'd been experimenting with something called the gateway tapes. I had originally gone into them pretty skeptical. I was mainly interested because I wanted a shortcut to achieving a deeper state of meditation. But I started having success with them surprisingly quickly. Eventually, I began experiencing things that I would describe as spiritual experiences. Looking back now, I sometimes wonder if I had somehow opened myself up to something I didn't understand. Maybe I'd simply put myself into a state where my mind could produce something incredibly vivid. Or maybe it was something else. I honestly don't know. All I know is that I went into those woods completely alone, sitting in a place I'd visited many times before, and for one brief moment I saw myself from somewhere I couldn't possibly have been standing. And whatever I saw standing behind me, I still don't know if it was something my mind created or if, for that 1 second, I was seeing something that was already there. This happened a few months ago with 2 of my friends. It was around 4 in the morning, and the 3 of us were hanging out in a small abandoned cabin in the woods behind my house. We'd been going there for a while. That night we were smoking weed, listening to music, and just messing around like we normally did. Nothing about the night felt unusual, until one of my friends suddenly turned the music down. He looked at us and said, "I'm not trying to sound paranoid or anything, but I just heard someone yell, and I saw the flash of a flashlight." At first I figured he was just high and getting paranoid, but I still took him seriously. We turned the music completely off and sat there in silence. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then we heard something moving through the leaves. At first I thought it was probably just rainwater falling from the trees. It had rained earlier, so there was still water dripping from the leaves, but the sound didn't stop. It got louder and louder until there was no mistaking what we were hearing. Footsteps. All 3 of us froze. It was 4 in the morning. There shouldn't have been anyone out there. The footsteps kept getting closer. We didn't say anything to each other. We just sat there listening as the sound slowly approached the cabin. Then the footsteps stopped just outside. We could hear someone walking around the cabin. For several minutes, none of us moved. We didn't whisper. We didn't look outside. We barely even breathed. We just sat there hoping whoever was out there would eventually leave. Eventually, the footsteps started moving away. They slowly faded into the distance until we couldn't hear them anymore. We waited a few more minutes before deciding it was safe. We grabbed all our stuff and got ready to leave. Before stepping outside, we each grabbed a stick from around the cabin to use as a weapon just in case. Then we got out of the woods as quickly as we could. We didn't talk much, we just wanted to get back to my house. When we finally reached my property though, we noticed something that immediately made all 3 of us stop. There was a huge branch lying across the front lawn. It had fallen right next to the path we'd taken when we first walked into the woods. The strange part was that the branch hadn't been there when we'd left about 45 minutes earlier. We stood there looking at it. None of us said anything, but we all had the same feeling. Something was wrong. Then I heard it. Footsteps. This time they were coming from behind my house. We didn't wait to find out who or what was making them. All 3 of us took off running down the street. We didn't look back. We just kept running until we reached the end of the street. By then, we were exhausted and stopped for a moment to catch our breath. That's when we heard it. A scream. It came from somewhere down the street behind us. I've heard people scream before. This wasn't like that. It sounded like someone screaming at the absolute top of their lungs, but there was something wrong with the sound. Something about it didn't sound human. The 3 of us just stood there for a second, completely terrified. Then we started running again. We didn't stop until we were far enough away that we finally felt like whatever had been following us couldn't reach us. After waiting around for a while, we eventually decided we couldn't stay out all night. So we went back to my house. We made it inside without seeing or hearing anything else. The next morning we went back outside. None of us had forgotten about the branch. We walked over to the tree it had fallen from. That's when we noticed something we hadn't seen the night before. There were knife marks all over the tree. Dozens of them. We just stood there staring at them. Even now, I don't know who had been in those woods that night. I don't know if the footsteps belonged to one person or several. I don't know what caused that scream, and I have no idea why someone had been carving into that tree with a knife. But I've thought about it a lot since then. Because if that person had actually been following us, I don't want to know what would have happened if they had caught up to us. When I was a young teenager, my church sent us on a long road trip to a youth camp deep in the Colorado mountains. It was a pretty great camp. There were outdoor activities, hiking, and all the usual things you'd expect. I was having a good time, and I'd been assigned to a cabin with about a dozen other boys around my age and one of the camp counselors. The counselor was a really good guy, and I remember getting along with him well. One day, our group went on a full-day hike farther into the mountains. At one point, we reached an area where we were going to stop for a while before turning back. Everyone was given about an hour to do whatever they wanted, as long as they stayed within the general area. Our counselor came up to me and 3 other guys and mentioned something he'd found the previous week. He said that he'd been exploring with another counselor and had come across what looked like an abandoned cabin not too far from where we were. He hadn't had time to check it out properly. He asked if the 4 of us wanted to go with him and take a look while everyone else stayed behind. We agreed. I don't remember exactly how far we walked, but eventually the trees opened up into a clearing, and that's when I first saw the cabin. I remember something feeling wrong almost immediately. The forest had been full of normal sounds while we'd been walking. Birds, wind through the trees, branches moving. But as soon as we stepped into that clearing, everything stopped. It became completely quiet, not gradually. It was almost like someone had switched the sound off. I also couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I kept looking toward the trees, expecting to see someone standing there. But there was nobody. The others seemed focused on the cabin, so I tried to ignore the feeling and followed them. From the outside, the cabin looked normal enough. It was old and clearly hadn't been maintained, but there wasn't anything immediately strange about it. Our counselor walked up to the windows and looked inside. He told us that it appeared to be mostly empty. Then he went around to the front door. It was already cracked open. He pushed it wider and stepped inside. We followed him. The first room was mostly empty. There wasn't much furniture and there was nothing that immediately suggested someone was actually living there. But that feeling of being watched hadn't gone away. If anything, it was stronger. Except now it wasn't just the feeling that someone was looking at us. There was something else. I remember feeling a kind of hatred coming from the woods. It sounds ridiculous saying it now, but that's genuinely how it felt. Like whatever was watching us didn't want us there. I started thinking that we should leave. I remember wanting to get back outside, but before we could, our counselor decided to check the last part of the cabin. We followed him into the back room, and that's when we saw it. In the middle of the floor was a large pentagram. Sitting in the center of it was a wooden chair. There was a toilet seat attached to the chair, and nails had been driven through it, covering the entire seat. None of us knew what we were looking at. We just knew that we wanted to get out. Everyone started freaking out. But our counselor still wanted to check the final room. He walked over and looked inside, and then he stopped. His entire expression changed. His face went completely white. For a second, he just stood there staring. Then he turned around and yelled at us to get the hell out. We didn't ask why. We ran. We flew out of that cabin and didn't stop until we were well away from it. We ran all the way back to where the rest of the group was supposed to meet us. Nobody talked much on the way. Once we were back with everyone else, our counselor told us not to talk about what we'd seen. He didn't explain much. He just wanted us to keep it quiet. Later, when we were back at our own cabin, I talked to the other guys who had gone with us. I asked them if they'd felt the same thing I had. They had. They'd all felt like something was watching us. They'd all noticed how strangely quiet the forest had become. One of the guys told me that while we were running away from the cabin, he'd started hearing a high-pitched, piercing buzzing in his ears. I hadn't noticed it myself. None of us ever figured out what had been going on in that cabin. We didn't know who owned it. We didn't know why the door had been left open. And we certainly didn't know why there was a pentagram and that strange chair sitting in the middle of the room. But there was one detail that still bothers me more than any of that. That final room. The one our counselor looked into. There was a gas stove inside, and a pot of water was boiling on it. The cabin was supposed to be abandoned, yet someone had been there recently enough for a fire to be burning under a pot of water, and whoever it was had apparently left before we arrived, or was still somewhere nearby. I'm in my 30s now. Since that trip, I've gone on several long backpacking trips through the mountains. I've spent plenty of time in remote places. I've walked through areas where you can go for miles without seeing another person. But I've never experienced anything like that again, and I don't think I'll ever forget the look on our counselor's face when he looked into that last room. Whatever had been happening in that cabin, he knew we needed to leave. I didn't work in the forest back then, but I spent a lot of time there. What happened to me was in the late summer of 1981, somewhere outside Lapine, Oregon. I was 13 years old. Earlier that year, my mom had passed away, and my dad thought the two of us needed some time away from everything. He wanted us to get out of town for a few days and spend some time together. He had a 1968 Volkswagen Westphalia that he'd been getting ready for camping, and he was excited to finally take it out. The campsite belonged to one of his friends, a guy named Jerry. It was somewhere around 20 miles northeast of Lapine. I've looked at maps since then trying to figure out exactly where we were, but I've never been able to find it. It was a long time ago, and at 13 I wasn't exactly paying attention to where we were going. We left Portland around noon on a Monday and reached the area about 4 hours later. The campsite was quite a way down a rough gravel road. After about 5 or 6 miles, even the gravel disappeared and the road turned into a narrow dirt track. My dad mentioned that he didn't think anyone had been out there in quite a while. Jerry had apparently told him the same thing, and the overgrowth along the road seemed to confirm it. Eventually, we reached the end of the road. There was a small clearing where we decided to set up camp. There wasn't much to it. We parked the van, pulled out the old canvas awning with its poles and ropes, unloaded the cooler, made a fire pit, and set up a couple of chairs. I was 13, so there was absolutely no chance I was sleeping in the van with my dad. I put up a small tent beside the passenger side of the van, threw my stuff inside, and considered myself set for the night. After we'd finished setting everything up, we spent some time walking around the area. There was a small creek nearby that was almost completely dried up. The area wasn't heavily forested. It was more typical of the eastern Oregon high desert, with scrub vegetation and scattered stands of smaller trees. Nothing about the place seemed particularly threatening. That changed later that night. My dad had been a Multnomah County sheriff before retiring and becoming a full-time musician. He also liked his cocktails. By the time we'd eaten dinner and were sitting around the fire, it was probably 8:30 or 9. He was on his 4th martini, maybe his 5th. At some point, we heard coyotes yipping somewhere in the distance. My dad thought it would be funny to answer them. He made a couple of stereotypical coyote calls. A few seconds later, they answered. He did it again. They answered again. Then they suddenly stopped. Everything went quiet. Except my dad. He called out one more time. And something answered. It wasn't a coyote. The sound was coming from somewhere to the southeast of us. It was a combination of a roar, a scream, and a shriek. And it went on for what felt like an incredibly long time. Probably 10 to 15 seconds. My dad looked at me and literally said, "What the hell was that?" I was scared, but I was 13. I was also curious. My dad made another coyote call. This time, the response came from a little closer, and more toward the east. It was another scream. At that point, my dad stopped treating it like a joke. He got his pistol, loaded it, and told me we should probably think about turning in for the night. Then we heard it again. The third scream. This one was close. Very close. I'd estimate somewhere between 50 and 75 feet away. And it wasn't just something I heard. I felt it. The sound seemed to hit us with so much force that I could feel it in my body. It came from a completely different direction this time. More northeast of where we were sitting. My dad lost it. He threw the cooler into the van, ripped the awning loose, and started throwing everything inside. We didn't pack. We didn't clean up. We didn't even try to figure out what had made the sound. We just left. My dad got that little Volkswagen moving as fast as it could, and we drove out of there. We left almost everything behind. Neither of us said much. We were completely silent for most of the drive. The first real conversation we had was when we stopped for fuel in Oak Ridge. Even then, it was strained. When we eventually got home, we talked about what had happened. Neither of us had an explanation. We agreed that whatever we'd heard wasn't something we recognized. And for whatever reason, we also agreed that maybe it was better not to talk about it too much. I've thought about that night many times since then. I'm older now. I've spent part of my life working in music, including production sound for both hard rock and country western acts. Because of that, I have a much better understanding of sound and decibels than I did when I was 13. I understand what it takes to produce that kind of sound pressure. And that's probably the part that bothers me the most, because whatever made that scream was close, very close, and it was loud enough that we didn't just hear it, we felt it. I was 13 when it happened, and at the time I was mostly frightened because I didn't understand what I was hearing. Now that I'm older, I understand something that scares me a lot more. Whatever was out there that night didn't need to come any closer. It was already close enough.